The Benedictine Priory at Norwich was established in 1096 by Herbert de Lossinger, who started building the cathedral the following year. He had brought 60 monks from Fécamp in northern France, and the community he led until his death in 1119 remained until Henry VIII dissolved the monastery in 1538. The size of the Norwich Priory was similar to those in Worcester and Winchester. While the cathedral was being built, it is likely that the monks lived in cells away from Norwich: St Leonard's in Norwich, Lynn, Yarmouth, Aldby and Bury St Edmunds. The rule of St Benedict governed the way the priory was run on a daily basis. When not in church, the monks spent their time reading in the cloister or working in the scriptorium, and some periods of work in the gardens or other physical labour. Their days were long, rising before 2 a.m. in winter and earlier in summer. On rising, they had to attend a series of services of prayer and psalms, their timings dependent on the seasons. In winter, nocturnes was at 3 a.m. and was followed by a period of reading until daybreak when matins took place. This was followed by prime when it was fully daylight. After prime, there was more reading, washing and changing from night to day shoes, whilst ordained monks said Mass. Next was terce and a Mass, the main services of the day, followed by the daily meeting in the chapter house, where misdemeanours were confessed and punishment meted out, and priory business was transacted. Finally came a sung Mass, after which the monks had their only meal of the day, at around 2 p.m. in winter and slightly earlier in summer. Reading and work in the scriptorium continued with a drink before the last service, which was Compline at about 7 p.m. In summer, there was a light supper. During the 14th and 15th centuries, generally the life of monks became a little easier, with the first service at midnight, and they then went back to bed until matins at 7 a.m. Their morning routines were adapted for an earlier dinner around 11:30 and a second meal, supper, in the winter months. The exceptions to this were Advent and Lent, but to what extent the Norwich Priory allowed this new relaxed routine is uncertain. Although we know that at the start of the Norwich Priory there were about 60 monks, the numbers couldn't be checked until the 14th century. After the plague, numbers were halved, but regained to 60 in around 1453, and then varied a great deal. At the dissolution, there were only 38. There was a total community, however, of around 270 people, which included those in the guest hall, servants whose masters were being entertained by the prior, labourers and other visitors. This represented an amazing 2% of the whole population in Norwich. St Benedict determined that the monastery should, if possible, be so arranged that all necessary things such as water, mill, garden and various crafts may be within the enclosure, so that monks may not be compelled to wander outside it, for that is not all expedient for their souls. That's in chapter 67 of his rule, and meant that the monastery should be self-sufficient and manual labour needed to be part of the role of the monk. It seems likely that manual labour was phased out to some extent when labourers became more available to work, which left the monks more time for praying and reading, particularly during the periods when the number of monks at the priory varied so much. Whilst the prior had day-to-day control over the efficient working of the community, it was normal in a Benedictine monastery to have a set of officers to look after the administration. These were called obidentiaries, and some roles are still apparent today, albeit with slightly different responsibilities, the sacrist and precentor being examples. Those concerned with providing food for the priory include the master of the cellar, who was responsible for provisioning grain, raw materials and wool, and the cellarer, who provided food other than grain and was in charge of the bakery, brewery and larder. The granarius was responsible to the cellarer for the granary. This was a post usually held by a layman, and in the early 14th centuries was held by William Beauchamp, a wealthy nobleman who also paid for the restoration of the Beauchamp Chapel in the cathedral, which had been destroyed during the 1272 riots. In Moira Forsyth's window in the chapel, Beauchamp is depicted as a monk, but this seems unlikely. In the Norwich Priory, the lower close area was reserved for monks and servants, and the upper close a place for activities of a more secular nature. Within the precincts of the close, there were 3 mills, a granary, and food processing buildings such as a bakehouse and brewhouse. There was also a mill at Trouse, which belonged to the cellarer, a watermill at Ellingham, and 3 windmills owned by the almoner. Grain came from the manors in the form of tithes, and markets in and around Norwich, as well as food farms. Vegetables, including onions, leeks, peas and broad beans, were grown, and the herb garden was established to provide flavourings for their food. There were fish ponds for ornamental purposes as well as for food, a smithy, stables and a swannery. In chapter 9 of the rule, St Benedict lays down that at daily meals, whether at noon or in mid-afternoon, it is enough, we believe, to provide all tables with 2 kinds of cooked food because of individual weaknesses. A generous pound of bread is enough for a day, whether for only 1 meal or for both dinner and supper. Let everyone, except the sick who are very weak, abstain entirely from eating the meat of 4-footed animals. So bread was the main staple, in accordance with the precept of humility. Panis monachorum was the finest bread, and for monks, second only in quality to simnel bread eaten by the highest social classes and monks at Westminster Abbey. Each loaf weighed about 2 pounds. Panis militum was the lower grade bread for servants and made from inferior flour. Panis ponderis minoris was the bread for guests. Even though St Benedict laid down that meat should not be eaten except for sick monks in the infirmary, there was some relaxation, and in the 13th century this rule had been circumvented by many monasteries by creating a second dining room serving meat or dividing the refectory in order to serve meat in part of it. In 1336, Pope Benedict XII ordered that half the monks were to eat in the refectory on any given day and on fast days, Advent and Lent. Fish was bought and consumed in large quantities. In 1327, 180,000 herring were bought. That's the equivalent of each monk eating 8 fish per day. After the Black Death, salmon, ling, eel, sprat, cod, sturgeon and roach were also eaten. Small amounts of eggs, milk and cheese was purchased, mainly for baking, and used alongside honey and dried fruit. Our current herb garden is not on the same site as the monastic infirmary garden, which was probably situated to the east and slightly south of the infirmary. What was originally grown there is uncertain, but the current herbs grown and having dual usage as both culinary and medicinal are lemon balm, sage, hops for brewing, marjoram, basil, wild strawberry, rosemary, tansy, and angelica. Naturally, these would not all be available all year round, but many could be preserved by drying. In addition, pilgrims and crusaders would have brought back knowledge of spices from the East, and these would have been available to buy. The cellarer regularly purchased pepper, cloves, cinnamon, cumin, and ginger. Monks would have drunk ale and wine. Two sorts of ale were brewed, a superior one for monks called Cervisia Bona and Cervisia Secunda for the guest hall. Both were made from barley malt. In chapter 40 of the rule, St Benedict continues, "It is therefore with some uneasiness that we specify the amount of food and drink for others. However, with due regard for the infirmities of the sick, we believe that a half bottle of wine a day is sufficient for each." During meals, there were readings as determined by St Benedict's rule. Reading will always accompany the meals of the brothers. The reader should not be the one who just happens to pick up the book, but someone who will read for a whole week, beginning on Sunday. Let there be complete silence. No whispering, no speaking, only the reader's voice should be heard there. The brothers should by turn serve one another's needs as they eat and drink, so that no one need ask for anything. Because of Holy Communion, and because the fast may be too hard for him to bear, the brother who is reader for the week is to receive some diluted wine before he begins to read. Afterward, he will take his meal with the weekly kitchen servers and the attendants. Brothers will read and sing, not according to rank, but according to their ability to benefit their hearers. Monks did not eat everything in front of them. The custom was for uneaten food to be given to the poor and to prisoners. In 1538, King Henry VIII dissolved the priory, and a dean and chapter replaced the prior and monks. Many of the monastic buildings were taken down and the stone used for building elsewhere. The close over time changed to become more residential, although we can still see traces of the old monastic way of life in some of the buildings.